Hey, what's up? Dave with Brazos Valley Strength, and today we're going to be talking about leg drive in the bench press. But specifically, we're going to be talking about foot position within that leg drive. So hopefully today's video will give us a good understanding of what we're really trying to create in the first place, and how our body types can really influence us and lead us towards a good starting point for what foot position might be best for us to get the same result and have good effective bench pressing and good stability and good leg drive. So if you haven't watched my original leg drive video, you kind of got to do that. So if you don't have a good fundamental understanding of what we're trying to create in the bench press with leg drive, we need to do that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time really diving into all that. I'll briefly cover it, but that video can be found up here. So check that one out, come back, and hopefully these things will make a whole lot more sense. But very, very briefly, leg drive in the bench press is not actually acting on the barbell. That's for some reason a big misconception. Your legs do not push into the bar, but they do very, very much create stability in our bench press and also really, really influence our arch. So if you're not doing a good job with leg drive, you're absolutely limiting strength in the bench press. But the way that I would really think about leg drive is the same way that people would think about bracing in the squats and deadlifts. Totally fundamental. We have to be able to do that well to be able to produce maximal force and be able to be as strong as we possibly can. But the leg drive on bench press, similarly to bracing on squats and deadlifts, is not going to be just an infinite route to strength. Another big thought with this that I wasn't really planning on spending a tremendous amount of time on in this video, but I was going to address. But now I think after posting some stuff on my story and asking for comments for this video to see what people really wanted to know about leg drive, it definitely has come more to my understanding that there's still a lot of misconceptions about where our arch comes from. So really, that is the point of this video, and how we're going to place our feet really influences our arch. But I wanted to take a step back here and look at those things, because that really, if we get a good understanding of that, then we will kind of automatically know where we need to put our feet in order to influence the rest of the arch. So I think the first and biggest thought here is that the arch on the bench press is not primarily coming from your thoracic spine. For some reason, I guess there's a general hesitancy around movement of the lumbar spine in general amongst lifters, especially if we're talking about like deadlifts or something like that. Whenever people see any degree of flexion in the lumbar spine, there's, and I don't even, it's not worth trying to justify that or not, but any movement of the lumbar spine tends to draw a lot of attention for people. And I think that hesitancy really influences the dialogue around understanding the bench press arch in the first place. And so I guess just to illustrate these, we'll start off demonstrating what we mean here and even segments of the spine in the first place. So, and we look at the sign for the spine from the side, we can see the natural curvature of the spine. And we need to define flexion and extension, because I'll be talking about both of those, and then anterior pelvic tilt and posterior pelvic tilt and how those interact with that. So first of all, we can see, I'll work top down here, that the thoracic spine, meaning the upper back area, kind of, we'll maybe just say kind of mid-trunk and up, we'll call thoracic spine. Rib cage area is another thoracic spine kind of area. It is situated towards flexion by a little bit. So especially, we see deadlifts that, a whole lot of rounding in the upper back. But for some reason, people tend to think that the upper back, the thoracic spine, moves similarly in both directions. And it doesn't. It has a whole lot more ability to move into flexion. So if we see flexion is rounding over forward, where extension is arching the back, is moving backwards. So if we work just below that, though, we can see the lumbar spine is biased towards that extension. So it's obviously flexed in the opposite direction. So just logically with these, those movements of the spine very much influence how they are able to move in the first place. And so if the thoracic spine was going to be the primary mover into the arch in the bench press, I don't know that we would see that kind of bias towards flexion in the first place. And I think if we look at some of the most popular, if you just Google search for arch in the bench press, we can take these images and look at where the actual arch is coming from. And all of these pictures, without any exceptions here, we can see that the upper back is fairly neutral, that there's a pretty straight line from that kind of mid-back area up to the shoulders. And then almost all of the curvature, even on the very extreme ones, is coming from that lumbar spine area. And that, having that kind of core understanding that the arch is coming from the lower back is crucial to understanding what you're going to feel in the bench press, understanding how you're going to create that tension and drive into the barbell, and really just create that whole posture in the first place. And then obviously our legs are going to influence all that as well. But that is a fundamental kind of cornerstone here that I think many people, and I heard it this week, on Instagram, somebody making a reel about how the upper back, the thoracic spine is where the arch is coming from. And it doesn't, that's not, at least primarily, where the arch in the bench press is really coming from. So, it's not inherently dangerous, despite what the private commenters on your Instagram page might say, but it is important to acknowledge that. Within that, if we're talking about extension in the lower back, we're also going to be talking about an anterior tilt of the pelvis. And I'm probably going to mostly talk about the anterior tilt of the pelvis relative to the legs, because I think it kind of like the flow works well there if we're trying to visualize that. But anterior tilt of the pelvis is the pelvis moving forward. So again, kind of biasing towards a general arch in the upper back, or in the entire back, I'm sorry. So the extension through the whole back also almost always is going to be an anterior pelvic tilt. So if we acknowledge that the arch is coming from the lower back, and that the anterior pelvic tilt very much is going to be associated with that, they're pretty much impossible to differentiate between the two, then our leg position is absolutely going to influence those other factors right there. So acknowledging that creating an anterior tilt in our pelvis as much as we can really will follow up that chain and create more extension in the low back and create a bigger arch overall. That's our starting point. That's kind of the basis of creating a good position. So beyond that, as far as setting up in the bench press, the two main points of contact that we're going to have, or the two main points of pressure, of tension in the bench press, are going to be our shoulders and our feet. That our shoulders are going to be driving down to the bench from pressure from our arms, and that position is going to be pinned into the bench. The other side of that is going to be our feet driving. A common way to show this is like a piece of paper or a ruler or something, and if we slide the two ends of the piece of paper together, we see that arch forming. That's essentially arching in the bench press, and we're just creating tension on both sides. Now, I guess the better way to express this in this case would be with that piece of paper. One side of the piece of paper is not moving. That's our shoulders being pinned in the bench with our arms. And the other side is our legs driving back towards our upper body to be able to create that arch. I did cover all of this in the original leg drive video. I just wanted to address it because I know in the lumbar arch segment right there it was going to come up, and I think it's important to acknowledge kind of where we're creating that arch and that pressure from in the first place. So I think in recent years we've seen a lot more people, generally smaller lifters, and I'm going to come back to that, but it's been a lot more popular, a lot more common to see many very good benchers, oftentimes, benching with their feet very far in front of their body. So instead of having their feet tucked behind their knees, we have the feet way out in front of the bench press, creating their leg drive, creating their arch. So that really, I think, is the cornerstone of the video that I wanted to make today, and really comparing the two styles, the style that I use with my feet further behind me, and the style where the feet are in front. And I guess the spoiler here is that I think both are viable. I really do think that both are viable, but I think that the main reason that I wanted to make this video is that it does seem like, from what I've seen online, that there's kind of a right and wrong right now. That the people who are doing the feet out in front tend to really believe that that's like just absolutely the best way to do it, and that it fits most people, and kind of the dialogue around it is that the feet out in front is the best way to bench press, and if you're not doing it that way, you kind of don't understand leg drive or whatever. So I wanted to take a look at that and basically examine that argument in the first place, and if the feet in front is a good bench press style. And it is, because it fits all of those other things that we've already established. That the feet being in front of you does create a good ability for you to drive your rib cage. I'll say rib cage. If I say rib cage, I'm kind of talking about midline of the body, especially on the front end, that I'm able to drive my rib cage towards the barbell, but that creates all of those other things, that I'm able to pin my shoulders down in the bench press, that I'm able to pull very much in that anterior pelvic tilt and create a good solid position overall. So as far as our goals with leg drive and creating an arch, it's totally fine. But I think that there's some limitations that people run into in competitions. And I also think that there's limitations based on body type. So this absolutely brings up the point of population and even kind of outliers in certain areas. I even mentioned this in my most recent video on deadlift grip width, and how oftentimes many of the things that we see very good lifters doing are like populations of lifters that are very well suited to those lifts. And that a lot of the advice is situated around people who are mechanically gifted and able to maximize those leverages very, very well. So on that subject here, with the bench press and with the feet out in front, I absolutely totally believe that that position is very much biased towards smaller lifters, and that's where we see most of this stuff happening, because the relative height of the bench press, the relative limb length and all of that, the position that they're able to create, and the angle of their leg relative to the bench and being able to move into that anterior pelvic tilt is based on size. That the bench height for me, the absolute bench height for me and a much smaller lifter, me being 5'11", 110 kilos, 240 pounds, versus somebody who's like 160 pounds and like 5'6" or something, is going to be very, very different. So for me, if I try to get into that position, you can see that my knee is not very far below my hip, that there's not going to be a natural bias towards that anterior pelvic tilt. And my legs are so long that now the angle between my foot and the floor even is starting to become like close to parallel, to where my leg drive, I'm going to have significantly more trouble with slipping, and we're going to come back to that part here too, with slipping and being able to actually maintain that extension, that anterior pelvic tilt in the first place. So me being a taller lifter, I don't think that I'm going to be able to create that position to actually influence my arch effectively. Now, does it create an okay, especially if I have carpet and good flooring to be able to drive off of, does it create a good stable position overall? Probably. I think it's fine. But putting that arch into the equation right here, I lose so much of my position if I try to accomplish things that way. So I don't think that if we're just looking at it from the ability to feel leverage into the ground, I think we're missing a big portion of it. And I've even heard some coaches say things like, where do your quads have the most efficiency? Is it going to be when they're at full flexion? Obviously that's a difficult range of motion for the quads, or when they're near full extension. It's not like the same argument. I think that that's ridiculous, because we're never going to limit our leg drive based on our quad strength, so like absolute quad strength, I don't think factors into the equation with this. So that argument I think is I don't know, silly. So the main thought here within all of this should be that, are we able with our current position to create as dramatic of an anterior tilt of our pelvis as we can, and then maintain that position overall? And if your feet out in front of you works for you, fantastic, great. I think that that's a pretty good solution. But for me, I'm always slipping. I don't have a good arch, so I have to come up with something else. So that's why I've gravitated towards my feet being much wider and much further behind me. So even in some of the pictures that I used earlier, we can look at many of those archers, that they're pretty dramatic and that their feet get way behind them. And I think even just as a brief aside within this, within the context of leg drive, some people were curious and asked about the just having your toes on the ground rather than like full foot. I don't know that I have a strong feeling here. Full foot on the ground is obviously a rule within USA powerlifting, within the IPF, that your whole foot has to be on the ground. That's the whole reason why I wear heels on the bench press. I actually feel better in flat shoes. I think grippier flat shoes like the Avantis are great for bench press. Whatever foot position you're in, but I just need my feet to be flat. So it allows me to get my feet back as far as I can to create that arch. But otherwise, if we're just worried about, if I wasn't worried about toe contact or whole foot contact overall, I don't think that I would go further back. I do think that having some ability or a good ability to effectively drive into the bench to create a little bit more active tension through the whole body is probably a good thing. But as we can see in some of these pictures, that if you can get your feet back far enough and the arch gets more and more dramatic, the reduction of range of motion makes a big difference right there. Then does that outweigh the stability that you get from really being able to create that solid foundation and drive more of your foot into the ground? I don't know that I feel super strongly, but I do think overall that for the majority of people, having a good ability to feel like you're pressing your feet into the ground is probably positive. But that whether your whole foot needs to be flat to accomplish that, I don't really think that that's the case. But having your whole foot on the ground obviously does limit the arch. So as far as like creating rules around the sport, I think it's a fine rule. So anyway, that's my big thought there. But with the bench here and me using my style of having my feet further back, I think one of the big limitations here for a lot of people is going to be, we'll call it mobility, but the ability to get into that position is not always comfortable for people. And that I am probably in a group as well, population wise. The way I squat, the way that I deadlift, I have apparently hips that allow me to get into very wide kind of open positions. And that allows me to effectively reduce the total length of my legs. By me being able to go wider, by me being able to go further back, I'm helping get rid of some of that leg that I have overall and get into a pretty effective arch. But many people my size and bigger, we just don't see those people having very big arches. Like all of the arches that get people upset online are going to be from smaller weight classes. And I think that so much of that just has to do with the absolute height of the bench press relative to the size of the person. And that larger people just are starting to run out of options. And so we can look at even like the 110s from this year's nationals, that all three of the top 110s benched with a style, we'll say more similar to mine, but none have really tremendous arches or anything like that. But I think a whole lot of that just does have to do with as sizes of people's bodies get bigger and bigger, that foot position out in front is going to be severely limiting their ability to maintain that anterior tilt of the pelvis and maintain the arch and actually create all of those other circumstances that create a really good overall stability, leg drive, and just arch in the bench press. But for sure, one of the main limitations here is just comfort. So I say this to many of my clients all the time, but just, in this conversation around arching and particularly around what we're going to feel in the lower back, is that getting into the most effective arch that we can is not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be a very comfortable thing to do. I think oftentimes bench press is one of people's lower, like their least favorite lifts. And I think a lot of it does come to this, that the effort that it takes to get into the position that's going to be the strongest is fairly high. That like for me to get into my arch and really create that good, strong, solid position, I really do have to try pretty hard, and I have to be pretty willing to be uncomfortable. And just from my experience working with a lot of clients, just using the cue for them to be willing to be significantly less comfortable in that moment to find their position, and even a whole lot of willingness to feel their lower backs, to feel the musculature of their lower back, even cramping to some degree. Like it's just part of it. And even, what I would say with that is that if you had your arm at a 90-degree angle, and I handed you a dumbbell, right? Like you wouldn't be surprised that you felt your bicep a whole lot, like holding that isometric. It's the same thing with extension in the low back. Like you're going to feel it to some degree, especially like competitions, people kind of have issues cramping in that area a good bit. Like your lower back is very, very much involved in creating that position. So I think accepting it is a big part of it. But as far as stance with toe angle, width of the feet, so many of those things just take trial and error, that I think I'm pretty lucky to be able to get into the position that I am, to be able to limit my leg length overall, to be able to create a pretty effective arch. But many people with similar proportions are not able to do that. And we see much more kind of normal looking bench presses, and ultimately that affects their arch and they end up with a flatter back. And that's just kind of all there is to it. But play around with toe angle. Turn your toes out, turn your toes in, see if that allows your hips a little bit more space to be able to get them back, or obviously more forward. Oftentimes those things, your toe angle really influences the amount of hip extension that you have. So if your butt is coming off the bench, working yourself into turning your toes out or in can limit those things overall, can change the foot position and get it to where your butt can't get on the bench. I'm sure I used this cue in the other video, in the leg drive video, but understanding that your lumbar spine is a big part of the arch, that curling your hips down to the bench during your setup is one of the best cues there is. And just putting a lot of effort into that position and kind of being willing to be uncomfortable there, I think absolutely makes a big difference. So as a final thought here, one of the main limitations, I think, with the feet in front style of bench pressing is how reliant it is on good shoes, good carpet, all of those things that we see very, very often in competitions. Many of these lifters complaining after meets that they struggle to actually perform the way that they wanted to because the equipment wasn't what they needed it to be, that the carpet was slippy or those kind of things. And it happens. And in training, right? That if you're training in a gym that doesn't have carpet under their platforms, many people bring their own carpets, which is fine, right? Like there's going to be carpets when we're actually training or when we're actually in a competition. There's carpet on the platform. So you may need a carpet to be able to use this, but it's a barrier. It's a barrier to training. And then relying on that in the competition, just hoping the carpet is going to be very, very good, is also potentially an issue. And so I don't think that if you know for sure that style of bench pressing is going to be the strongest for your bench, that you should avoid it. Obviously, we want to be able to do that. But it has to be something that you take into account, that there may be some limitations in competition. And if you continue to have that issue in meets, that you need to be able to assess it and maybe try something else. So that's obviously an issue for many, many people. Bring your carpet. Bring your carpet to the gym. I mean, I think it kind of looks silly, but I totally understand the need for it, and that oftentimes it really does make a big difference for just being able to train effectively right there. So long story short with this, I think both styles are very effective. And I think they're effective for the exact same reasons. Is we're looking to create a position that we are really creating an extension bias in our lumbar back, an anterior tilt bias in our pelvis, and that we're able to stabilize that position while driving very effectively into our shoulders and maintaining that stability, maintaining our arch, and being able to transfer force into the barbell. most of the time, smaller lifters, as we go down in weight classes, the feet in front is going to become a lot more prevalent and just a lot more likely that it's going to work pretty well for them. As we get bigger, I don't think the feet way out in front is going to be as effective for creating an arch. I just think that when we can see kind of on population level that those lifters are not generally going to have as big of an arch anyway, and that we may want to bias more towards a wider stance and stability and things like that to create some of those general structures and general strength that we may be lacking from some of the positions that some of those smaller lifters are able to get into overall. So if you do have any comments on this, I'm definitely interested. The video ended up especially with the comments on my Instagram this week. It ended up, I wanted to talk about more than I originally intended to today. Turned out to be a longer video than I originally intended it to be. I thought it was going to be pretty, simple and straightforward. But if you disagree, I guess let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to have a good discussion. If you're willing to have a good discussion with me, I'll have it with you. But leave me a comment whether you agree or disagree, or any other maybe even like population things that you found that maybe influence the arch overall, or anything that I missed. Let me know in the comments. So if you did like the video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.